The air in the high-rise executive suite was razor-sharp, a calculated chill designed to keep the city's most dangerous egos in check. Park Siheon stood motionless against the floor-to-ceiling glass, his silhouette a jagged edge against the glittering sprawl of Seoul, a kingdom he ruled with a silent iron hand. Below him, the gala hummed with a superficial elegance, a sea of sycophants and sharp-suited men who bowed their heads and practiced deference as they passed. Siheon was an untouchable statue in the center of the storm, his neck and arms a canvas of intricate black tattoos that signaled a lethal dominant authority to anyone brave enough to meet the ice in his gaze. He wore his title like a heavy, invisible cloak he never intended to take off. Then, the atmosphere shifted. Zariah Monroe walked into the room, and the very quality of the air transformed from a frozen vacuum into a vibrant electric hum. She didn't just enter, she commanded the space, her skin glowing like polished mahogany against the sharp lines of her sleeveless black dress. She moved with the poised confidence of a Hollywood star who had walked 1,000 red carpets and feared none of them. Siheon felt a dormant, heavy thump against his ribs, a heart he had long ago relegated to the shadows. His cold analysis failed. He didn't see a political asset or a socialite threat. He saw a sun, and for the first time in his calculated life, he felt a desperate, visceral need to be burned by its warmth. He cut through the crowd with a predatory focus, his guards melting into the shadows as the emperor descended from his perch. The room gave him a wide, instinctive berth, the chatter dying into a tense silence as he reached her. Zariah was mid-conversation with a flustered movie producer when she felt the pressure change, the heavy, static charge that precedes a massive thunderstorm. She turned, and her eyes collided with his. Siheon's gaze was not admiring, it was consuming, a dark force that searched for the core of her beneath the Hollywood polish. Most people would have flinched under the weight of his dominant aura, but Zariah merely offered a satisfied, knowing smile. She turned her body fully toward him, dismissing the producer with a casual flick of her hand. "You're blocking my view," she said, her voice a melodic, self-assured sound that cut through the vacuum of the room. It wasn't the view she was talking about, and the electric jolt that shot through Siheon told him he had finally met someone who didn't believe in scary stories. "The view," Siheon rumbled, his voice a low, dangerous vibration, "seems to have improved significantly from where I'm standing." He took a step closer, her scent, something wild and uniquely warm, invading his senses and shattering his restrained passion. The space between them crackled with an energy so palpable the nearby socialites edged back, sensing the rules of the city being rewritten in real time. "Perhaps the stories about me are true," he murmured, his eyes dropping to the steady, fearless pulse at the base of her throat. "Perhaps they are," she countered, her gaze drifting deliberately from his eyes to his mouth and back, sending a bolt of pure, sovereign heat straight through him. A man who has to rely on fear to be seen must be a little lonely, don't you think? The morning after the gala, Zariah's hotel suite in the heart of Seoul began to fill with a quiet, impossible garden. There was no card and no signature, only a single midnight black orchid resting in a crystal vase, its velvet petals seeming to drink the light from the room. It radiated a beauty that was exotic, rare, and undeniably dangerous, just like the man who had sent it. Zariah touched the soft bloom, a shiver tracing its way down her spine as the memory of the emperor's hand on the small of her back resurfaced, a warm, lingering imprint that logic and her usual self-assured control could not erase. Every sensible bone in her body told her to have her assistant send the flower back, to block the number she didn't even have, and to retreat into the safety of her professional life. But the gift was a message as clear as his intense gaze. Park Siheon was thinking of her. The next day, a simple, heavy box arrived. Inside, nestled on black silk, was not the expected display of diamonds or gold, but a rare first edition of a classic American novel. It was a story Zoraya had mentioned only in passing during their dance, a casual comment about a favorite childhood book. Her breath caught as she turned the aged pages. This was different from the usual displays of power she encountered in Hollywood. This wasn't just wealth, it was listening. It was a predator learning the song of its prey to lure it more effectively. A part of her whispered a warning, but a louder, more insistent part wondered if it was a lonely man holding out a piece of himself, proving he knew how to speak her language. Her private phone, a number known to only a handful of people, buzzed against the mahogany table. Did the story arrive safely? The text from the unknown number felt like a cliff edge. Her fingers hovered over the screen, her heart, a dormant drum she had long forgotten, beginning to find its rhythm. "It's a dangerous thing to give a woman a piece of her past," she typed back. "It makes the present feel less solid." His reply arrived with the weight of a decree. "Your present is with me. I would like to make it solid. Dinner tonight." It wasn't a question, but the pause that followed felt like one. The king was requesting, not commanding, and that was the subtle difference that undid her defenses. She sent back a single word that felt like a surrender. Yes. Siheon didn't take her to a public restaurant where the city's elite could whisper and stare. Instead, a black car, silent and sleek as a shadow, collected Zoraya and drove her high into the mist-covered hills. The climb was steep, moving away from the neon pulse of the city toward a traditional hanok house that seemed to hang over the edge of the world, its paper lattice doors thrown open to the cooling night air. He was waiting for her on the polished wooden floor, silhouetted by the warm amber glow of the interior. He had traded the sharp armor-like suit of the gala for simple dark trousers and a soft-looking sweater that clung to the powerful lines of his frame. Without the formal layers, he looked younger, his sharp features softened by the candlelight, yet the intricate ink creeping up his neck made him look more dangerous than ever. "No guards?" Zoraya asked, her voice barely a whisper as she stepped over the threshold and into his private world. "They are nearby," Siheon said, his dark eyes never leaving her face, as if memorizing the way the light hit her skin. The dinner was a quiet, intimate affair, a stark contrast to the performative luxury of the penthouse. They spoke of small things at first, the filming of her movie, the strange, flickering beauty of Seoul by night, and the classic stories they both loved. But as the moon rose higher, painting the Zen garden in strokes of silver, the conversation began to dive into the shadows. "They call you the emperor of this city," Zoraya said, her courage fortified by a glass of sweet plum wine. "But what do they call you when the doors are closed and the titles are put away?" Siheon looked at her, and for a fleeting, vulnerable moment, the iron walls behind his eyes finally came down. Zoraya didn't see a ruthless king in that moment. She saw a boy who had been forced to build a fortress around his heart far too young. "They call me nothing," he admitted, his voice dropping to a low, devastating rumble. "Because when the lights go down, there is no one here to call me anything at all." The confession hung in the air, heavy and raw. He spoke of a life where every smile had a hidden price and every handshake was a calculated move in a deadly game. He didn't give her details of the blood or the betrayals, and she didn't need them. He gave her the feeling, the immense, crushing weight of a crown made of ice and iron. He walked her to the edge of the veranda, staring out at the sprawling tapestry of light he commanded. "I build empires, Zoraya," he murmured, his voice rough with a loneliness that mirrored the vastness of the city below. "I own every street and every shadow, but I have never built a home." Zoraya felt her careful distance crumble. The magnetic pull wasn't just toward his power anymore, but toward the wounded, hidden core of the man standing before her. She realized then that the most feared man in Seoul knew everything about absolute dominance, but absolutely nothing about peace. The silence on the veranda was no longer empty. It was thick, charged with the kind of heavy static tension that precedes a violent atmospheric shift. The sprawling lights of Seoul below seemed to fade into a distant flickering blur, leaving only the two of them anchored to the edge of the world. Zoraya looked up at Siheon, her breath hitching as she saw the raw honesty in his expression. For the first time, the controlled dominance he projected was beginning to fray, revealing a man who was starving for the very thing he claimed to have never built. "You're looking at me like I'm a problem you can't solve, Siheon," Zoraya whispered, her voice a low, melodic vibration that seemed to ripple through the cool night air. "You are a problem," he countered, his voice dropping to a dangerous, gravelly rumble. He took a single step closer, closing the final inch of distance between them. "You're a variable I never accounted for. You're the first thing in this city I can't command to stay, and the only thing I can't stand to let go." His hand moved, not with the clinical precision of a mafia boss, but with a desperate, localized heat. His fingers, covered in the dark, intricate ink of his legacy, traced the line of her jaw before tangling in the smooth waves of her hair. The touch was possessive, yet there was a tremor in his fingertips that spoke of a deep, restrained passion finally reaching its breaking point. Zoraya didn't flinch. She leaned into the contact, her eyes searching his obsidian gaze. "Then stop trying to solve me," she murmured, her own composed confidence melting into a reckless, sovereign desire, "and just see me." That was the final fracture in his iron wall. Siheon leaned in, his mouth crashing against hers in a kiss that was a collision of silk and steel. It wasn't a gentle exploration, it was an act of pure, unadulterated hunger. It was the taste of a man who had spent a lifetime in a frozen wasteland finally reaching the sun. The kiss was consuming, a dark, intense force that seemed to pull the very air out of Zoraya's lungs, replacing it with the scent of his expensive cologne and the metallic tang of his suppressed power. As he wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her flush against the hard, unyielding lines of his frame, Zoraya felt a jolt of electric clarity. This wasn't just a romantic interlude. She realized in that moment that she wasn't just falling for a man, she was standing in the center of a hurricane. To love Park Siheon was to invite the storm into her blood, to stand on the precipice of a world where scary stories were the daily reality. He pulled back just enough to rest his forehead against hers, his breath coming in ragged, uneven hitches. His eyes were closed, his expression of one of restrained passion that bordered on agony. In the quiet of the hills, with the empire he ruled lying at their feet, Zoraya realized that the rules of her life had already begun to rewrite themselves. She was no longer just a star visiting a foreign city. She was the heartbeat of a king who would burn the world to the ground just to keep her warm. The danger was palpable, a pressure change that hummed in her marrow, but as Siheon tightened his grip, she knew she wasn't ready to seek shelter. She wanted to see exactly how much of the city he would rewrite for her. In the weeks that followed, the city of Seoul became a mere backdrop for the secret universe they constructed in the seams of their public lives. To the world, Zoraya Monroe was the untouchable star on a grueling film schedule, and Park Siheon was the iron-fisted sovereign navigating a treacherous political landscape. But in the stolen hours, those deep, quiet pockets of the night when the sirens faded and the sycophants slept, the emperor and the star belonged only to each other. Siheon operated with a silent, terrifying efficiency to ensure their sanctuary remained unbreached. He didn't just provide security, he used his vast, shadowed influence to curate a world of sensual warmth specifically for her. When Zoraya mentioned a craving for a specific vintage of wine only found in a small village in France, it appeared on her table by sunset. When the paparazzi grew too bold near her film set, they didn't just leave, they vanished from the district entirely, moved by an invisible hand they dared not question.
Yet it was in the private stillness of the Hanok house that his power took its most intoxicating form. There, Siheon used his authority not to command, but to worship. He would spend hours simply watching her, his restrained passion manifesting in the way he would personally prepare her tea or drape a heavy silk throw over her shoulders when the mountain air turned crisp. He treated her not as a trophy, but as a sacred relic he had spent a lifetime searching for. One evening, deep within their cocoon, he found him tracing the gold flecks in her eyes with a focus so intense it felt like a physical weight. "Zariah move mountains for me, Siheon," she whispered, her hand coming up to rest against the dark ink on his neck. "You rewrite the logistics of this entire city so we can have an hour of peace. Doesn't the emperor ever get tired of serving?"
Siheon closed his eyes, leaning into her palm with a quiet authority that had softened into pure devotion. "The emperor is a mask I wear to keep the wolves at bay," he murmured, his voice a low vibration against her skin. "But here, in the dark, I am just a man who has finally found his North Star. There is no exhaustion in worshiping the light that saved you from the freeze." He pulled her closer, his touch possessive yet reverent, his lips tracing the pulse at her throat with a semi-sexually charged intensity that left her breathless. In these moments, the scary stories of his violence felt like a distant myth. He would lay her back against the cushions, his hands, the same hands that decided the fate of industries, moving over her skin with a surgical tenderness. He explored the polished mahogany of her curves as if he were mapping a new territory, his closed eyes suggesting a desire so deep it was almost spiritual. Zariah felt herself becoming lost in him, the lines between her reality and his fantasy blurring into a single seamless heartbeat. She was no longer just an actress playing a role. She was the sovereign of his private heart. They were building something fragile and beautiful in the eye of a hurricane, a secret kingdom where the only rules were written in the language of their shared breath. But even as she surrendered to his touch, a part of her couldn't ignore the static in the air, the knowledge that a secret this powerful could only stay hidden for so long before the world outside demanded its share of the fire. The heavy, humid air of a Seoul summer evening pressed against the paper screens of the Hanok, but inside, the atmosphere was thick with a different kind of weight. Siheon sat on the edge of the darkened veranda, the ink on his rolled-up sleeves looking like shadows come to life against his skin. He wasn't the untouchable statue tonight. There was a fracture in his quiet authority, a subtle tremor in the way he held his glass of untouched whiskey. Zariah approached him silently, her silk robe whispering against the wood. She could feel the pressure change in the room, that static charge that usually signaled a display of his terrifying power. But as she placed a hand on his shoulder, Siheon didn't pull her into his lap with his usual controlled dominance. Instead, he leaned his forehead against her stomach and let out a long breath that sounded like a long-suppressed surrender. "The board is shifting, Zariah," he murmured, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that sent a chill through her. "Cho Sung-jae is moving. He's looking for the one thing I value more than the city, and for the first time in my life, I've given him a target." He looked up at her, his obsidian eyes no longer clinical or surgical, but raw with a restrained passion that bordered on fear. "I told you I'd rewrite the rules for you. I've spent my life making rules that keep people out, rules that ensure I am the only one left standing when the smoke clears. But those rules don't protect you. They only make you a prisoner of my shadow." He reached out, his tattooed fingers trembling as they traced the polished mahogany of her hand. Then, in a move that shattered every myth of the ruthless emperor, Siheon slid from the bench and knelt on the floor before her. He didn't do it with the flair of a movie scene. He did it with the heavy, localized heat of a man who was stripping off his armor for the first time. "I am begging you for something I have never asked of anyone," he whispered, his voice dropping so low it was almost lost to the mountain wind.
I'm asking you to trust me, not in my power and not in my name. I'm asking you to trust the man who has nothing but this moment." He took her hand, pressing his face into her palm, his closed eyes suggesting an intensity mixed with a profound, aching vulnerability. "The rules of this city say that I must be a monster to keep what is mine, but I will burn every law, every legacy, and every street I own if it means I can keep you safe. I will rewrite the very fabric of this life so that you never have to flinch at my name. But I need you to stay in the storm with me just a little longer. Don't let the scary stories drive you away." Zariah felt the emotional upper hand shift. It wasn't about power anymore. It was about the sacred plea of a soul that had been frozen for too long. She looked down at the most feared man in Seoul, seeing the lonely man she had glimpsed at the gala. She reached down, her fingers tangling in his hair, pulling his face up so she could look into his eyes. "You don't have to rewrite the city for me, Siheon," she murmured, her voice filled with sensual warmth and a new sovereign strength. "You just have to keep being the man who listens. The storm is already here. I'm not looking for a shelter. I'm looking for you." As he stood and pulled her into a kiss that felt like a vow, the semi-sexually charged energy between them reached a fever pitch. But beneath the desire was a new, solid foundation. The emperor had surrendered his crown to the star, and in that private sanctuary, the first rule had already been rewritten. He was no longer alone. The following night, the fragile peace of the secret universe was not just broken, it was obliterated. The transition from the sensual warmth of the Hanok to the gasoline and fear of the underworld happened in the span of a single, jagged heartbeat. Zariah was leaving the film set, the cooling evening air a welcome relief after hours under the artificial heat of the studio lights. She was still humming the melody of the song that Siheon had played for her the night before, her mind lingering on the way his restrained passion had felt against her skin. She reached for the door of her car, expecting the familiar silent greeting of her driver. Instead, the world erupted into a storm-like burst of violence. The driver was gone, replaced by a shadow with eyes as cold as a winter grave. Before she could scream, a heavy chemical-scented cloth was pressed against her face. She fought with the composed confidence that had always been her armor, but against the raw, clinical brutality of Siheon's world, she was a star being swallowed by a black hole. As she was shoved into the back of a nondescript van, the last thing she saw through the blurring haze was the cold, triumphant silhouette of Han Se-rin standing in the distance, watching her fall. When the world returned, it was gray and smelling of damp concrete and old rot. Zariah found herself bound to a rusted chair in a warehouse that felt like the literal abyss Siheon had warned her about. The star energy that usually radiated from her was dimmed by the harsh flickering overhead light. "The Emperor has a weakness," a voice rumbled from the dark. Assemblyman Cho Sung-jae stepped into the light, his face a mask of predatory satisfaction. He didn't look like a politician, he looked like a butcher. "He thinks he can rewrite the rules of this city for a Hollywood actress. He forgot that the rules are written in blood, not script." Zariah looked at him, her heart a dormant drum now thundering with a visceral, grounding terror. She realized then the true price of his love. Loving Park Siheon wasn't just about stolen hours and rare orchids, it was about being the target in a war that never ended. She was no longer just an actress playing a role, she was the sovereign of his private heart. She leaned in close, the smell of cheap tobacco and malice invading her senses. He pulled out a phone and began to record, his hand gripping her jaw with a violence that made her skin crawl. "Say something, star. Tell him how the shadows feel." As the camera lens stared at her like a cold, unblinking eye, Zariah didn't cry. She thought of Siheon's sacred plea and the way he had knelt before her.
She realized that the hurricane she had chosen was now tearing through her life, and as the first blow landed, she understood that to belong to the emperor was to invite the wrath of the city into her very soul. The dream was shattered, replaced by a cold, surgical reality. She was the bait, and the king was coming to burn the world down to find her. The video sent to Siheon's private line was only 10 seconds long, but it was enough to turn the controlled dominance of the mafia emperor into a localized apocalyptic storm. When he saw Cho Sung-jae's hand bruise the polished mahogany of Zoraya's jaw, the last shred of Siheon's humanity, the part that still played by the city's rules, simply evaporated. He didn't call for a tactical team. He didn't wait for Ryu Kwan to mobilize the enforcers. He climbed into a matte black sedan and drove toward the docks with a surgical coldness that made the air inside the car crackle with lethal intent. He arrived at the warehouse not as a man, but as a force of nature. The guards at the perimeter didn't even have time to raise their weapons. Siheon moved with a preternatural speed that defied the human eye, a blur of ink and shadow. He was a phantom of ice and iron, slipping through the darkness and leaving only the sound of snapping bone and silenced gasps in his wake. He didn't use a gun. That was too distant, too clinical. He used his hands, the hands that had worshipped Zoraya in the stolen hours, to erase the men who had dared to stand in the way of his light. The warehouse doors groaned as Siheon kicked them open, the sound echoing through the cavernous space like a thunderclap. Inside, the light was harsh and flickering, casting long, jagged shadows against the concrete. Cho Sung-jae stood near Zoraya, his predatory satisfaction turning into a cold, visceral terror as he saw the figure in the doorway. Siheon didn't shout. He didn't make a grand speech. He simply walked forward, his eyes closed for a brief second as he centered the restrained passion that was now a roaring furnace. When he opened them, they were obsidian wells of absolute destruction. "You told her the rules are written in blood, Cho," Siheon rumbled, his voice a low, vibrating growl that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. "So let's see how much you have to contribute to the ink." Cho scrambled for his weapon, but Siheon was already there. He moved across the floor with a fluidity that looked like a glitch in reality. One moment he was 10 feet away, the next he was a hand's breadth from Cho's face. He disarmed the politician with a sickening crunch, his movements surgical and absolute. He didn't just fight, he dismantled. Every strike was a vow of protection, every movement a sacred plea transformed into a weapon. As Cho slumped to the floor, a broken ruin of a man, Siheon didn't offer a final blow. He didn't even look at him. His focus shifted entirely to the woman bound in the center of the room. The wrath of the emperor vanished instantly, replaced by a sensual warmth so intense it was almost painful. He reached Zoraya in a heartbeat, his tattooed hands trembling as they moved to cut her restraints. He didn't ask if she was okay. He could see the shattered dream in her eyes, the raw trauma of the abyss. He simply pulled her into his chest, his arms wrapping around her with a protective yet possessive intensity that blocked out the rest of the world. "I'm here," he whispered into her hair, his voice breaking for the first time. "The storm is over. I've erased them, Zoraya. I've rewritten the end of this story." Zoraya clung to him, her breath coming in ragged hitches against the black silk of his shirt. She could feel the heat radiating off him, the pure, unadulterated hunger of a man who had nearly lost his soul and had clawed his way back through a mountain of shadows to find it. The warehouse was silent now, the gasoline and fear replaced by the heavy, grounding scent of his cologne and the steady, thundering beat of a heart that beat only for her. The emperor had arrived to save his queen, but as they stood in the wreckage of the night, Siheon knew that saving her was only the beginning. To truly keep her,
He would have to do the one thing he had never dared. He would have to kill the king to save the man. The aftermath of the warehouse was a hollow, ringing silence that followed them all the way back to the sanctuary of the hills. The surgical coldness that had fueled Siheon's rescue had evaporated, leaving behind a man who looked physically burdened by the weight of the air itself. Inside the Hanuk, the amber glow of the lanterns felt intrusive, casting long, jagged shadows reminding them both of the abyss they had just escaped. Zoraya sat on the edge of the silk-covered dais, her hands still trembling slightly, the polished mahogany of her skin marred by the faint blooming purple of a bruise, a permanent record of the price of his love. Siheon stood by the latticed doors, staring out at the city he had ruled with such controlled dominance. The sprawling lights of Seoul, once his pride, now looked like a sea of jagged glass. He didn't look like an emperor, he looked like a man standing at the edge of his own funeral. Without a word, he turned and walked towards her, every movement heavy with a restrained passion that had turned into a profound, aching sorrow. In a move that felt like the world tilting on its axis, Siheon dropped to his knees at her feet. He didn't do it with the grace of a performer. It was a collapse, a total surrender of the quiet authority that had defined his life. He pressed his forehead against her knees, his tattooed hands, the same ones that had moved with preternatural speed to erase her captors, now clutching the fabric of her dress as if it were the only thing keeping him from drifting into the dark. "I promise to rewrite the rules for you, Zoraya," he murmured, his broken, gravelly vibration cracked against the stillness of the room. He looked up at her, his obsidian eyes brimming with a sacred plea that was raw and bleeding. "I saw the light leave your eyes in that video. I saw my world staining yours, and I realized that as long as I am the emperor, you will always be a target. My legacy is a poison, and I have been forcing you to drink it." Zoraya reached out, her fingers tracing the sharp line of his jaw, her sensual warmth grounding him. "Siheon, you saved me. You came for me when no one else would." "I shouldn't have had to save you from a war I created," he countered, his voice rising with a desperate intensity. "I am abdicating, Zoraya. Tonight, the Emperor dies. I'm dismantling the Empire, handing the keys to Ryu Kwan, and walking away from the shadows. I will give up every street, every cent of the blood money, and every ounce of power I've spent a lifetime building." He took her hands in his grip possessive yet pleading. "I don't want the city. I want the stolen hours to be our entire lives. I want to build that home I told you about, the one that isn't a fortress. I am offering you a man with no title, no guards, and no crown. Just a man who worships you enough to burn his own kingdom to the ground to keep you safe forever." The silence that followed was a semi-sexually charged with a new kind of intimacy, one of total, terrifying transparency. Zoraya looked down at him, seeing the restrained passion finally uncoiling into a promise of peace. The scary stories were over. In the quiet of the mountain air, the Mafia King had performed his final act of dominance. He had conquered himself. He remained on his knees, an emperor waiting for his queen to decide if the man he had become was enough to rewrite their forever. The transition from the world of shadows to the light began with a single physical act of destruction that was also a birth. In the quiet of the Hanuk, beneath the watchful gaze of the moon, Siheon reached into the pocket of his black shirt and pulled out the heavy gold signet ring of the Park family, the legacy ring that had commanded the city's fear for 3 generations. It was a crown of iron and blood, a symbol of the controlled dominance that had nearly cost him the only thing he truly loved.
Zaria watched, her sensual warmth steady and unwavering, as Siheon took a small silver mallet from a nearby chest. With a surgical precision that was now fueled by hope rather than wrath, he struck the gold. The ring didn't just bend, it cracked, the ancient gold splitting apart to reveal a secret it had held in its core for decades. From the wreckage of the legacy, Siheon pulled a simple, flawless band of platinum. "My father told me once that the gold was for the city to see," Siheon whispered, his voice no longer a dangerous rumble but a clear, resonant vow. "But the platinum was for the man I was supposed to become. He knew the throne would be a cage. He hidden this inside, waiting for the day I found a reason to break the bars." He took Zaria's hand, his tattooed fingers, once the instruments of preternatural speed and violence, now moving with a reverence that was purely seductive and lost in her presence. He slid the platinum band onto her finger. It was a perfect fit, a symbol not of a dark empire, but of a shared future forged from the center of a storm. "The Emperor is dead, Zaria," he murmured, leaning in close until their foreheads touched. The restrained passion that had once been a burden was now a steady, glowing heat. "And I've realized that the rules of this city don't matter if I'm not in it. I've signed the final papers. Ryu Kwan is the new face of the shadow. I am just Siheon, a man who wants to wake up to your light every morning." Zaria felt the emotional upper hand dissolve into a deep soul-level partnership. She looked at the ring, then up at the man who had dismantled his entire universe just to stand beside her. The scary stories had been rewritten into a testament of pure, unadulterated hunger for a life of peace. "One kiss," she whispered, echoing the challenge she had thrown at him in the penthouse so long ago. "And you really did rewrite the rules of this city." "I didn't just rewrite the rules," Siheon countered, his lips curving to a rare, genuine smile that reached his obsidian eyes. "I burned the book." He pulled her into a kiss that tasted of freedom and jasmine, a long, semi-sexually charged embrace that marked the end of their stolen hours and the beginning of their forever. They stood up together, moving away from the darkened veranda and toward the sliding doors. Hand in hand, they stepped out of the Hanok house and into the soft, dawning light of a new day. The city of Seoul glittered below them, but for the first time it didn't look like a kingdom to be conquered, it looked like a world to be lived in. The king was dead. Long live the man. And as they walked down the mountain path, leaving the shadows of the ruthless emperor behind them, Zaria knew that the most powerful thing Park Siheon had ever done wasn't ruling the city, it was choosing her. This is where tonight's story ends, but the secrets never do. If you enjoyed uncovering the hidden power, the silent strength, and the moments that changed everything, make sure you subscribe, like, and share. New stories drop here where power hides in plain sight and the unexpected always rises. Like, share, and tell us what story you want uncovered next. Until next time, stay curious and watch closely.